I'll just quickly reintroduce myself just for everyone that is joining, and we'll get started. So that's us 5 minutes after the hour, so I'm quite keen to get started. And hopefully we can get through some good content today within our kettlebell workshop that is going to be useful for you guys to take some information away. There is going to be some workshop notes that I will share with you towards the end of today's session. So I will share over some notes that I'll be using within my session for you guys to keep, which is, again, another useful tool for you guys to have. And the recording for today's session will be available in around about a week's time or so. So we do edit the presentations after the recording's been uploaded onto Zoom. We then have to download that from the cloud. We have to make some slight edits to make sure that it's kind of user-friendly, and we'll then share that back out. So all you need to do in about a week's time is just get in touch with the office if you would like access to this video again, and they'll send that out to you in sort of about a week's time. So you need to get back in touch with the office if that's something that you're interested in doing. So we're just going to kind of have a quick look at what we're going to cover today, and just have a quick reminder about what kind of is going to be hopefully, or what you guys are going to find useful within this session that we'll be running through. So hopefully you're able to see this screen share on your screen now. And like I said, the idea of today's session is just to try and increase some kettlebell confidence when it comes to sort of the key kettlebell movements. So we're really going to focus deeply and quite a bit of time on 4 specific movements we're going to be thinking about, and getting really proficient and getting good, strong confidence when it comes to these 4 movements. And if we've got time, we'll spend a bit of time looking at some other movements on the tail end of that. So the kind of learning outcomes and main things that I want to sort of get from today's session is just getting a bit close and personal with your kettlebell, getting really kind of comfortable with this piece of equipment. So start to get used to the anatomy of a kettlebell, and I'll introduce this workbook so that you guys are going to get access to that at the end of today's session. We're then going to start looking at some of the 4 fundamental movements, which I believe are essential. If you can get down and really get confident and competent with these 4 movements, I do believe that will help you with any potential kettlebell movement, as well as any other movements that you want to do, not just using a kettlebell, but it might be using a barbell or any other piece of equipment. So the 4 movements that I want to really get sort of proficient within today's workshop, having only got 2 hours of time to spend with you guys, is making sure that we're kind of confident with squatting with a kettlebell and just squatting in general, deadlifting and moving safely, doing a deadlift with kettlebells, as well as talking about some of the variations that are possible within these 2 movements. The kettlebell swing, it's probably where we're going to spend most of our time, and just using that triple extension with the ankle, knees and hips, and making sure that we've got a really good understanding of what the kind of main things we want to be doing and the main things we do not want to be doing when it comes to the kettlebell swing. And then finally, the sort of Turkish get-up, which is quite a functional movement. So all of these movements, I believe, are fundamental as well as functional, which means they have got quite strong links into day-to-day movements. So squatting is obviously as simple as getting up and off a chair. Deadlift is if you're having to pick anything up from the floor or carry some shopping, you can probably safely deadlift that up from the ground. Swinging is just being nice and confident and moving your hips back and forth. And Turkish get-up is just kind of being confident and being able to get up and off the floor. But obviously, if you can do it with a weight, then it's going to support you to be able to do that unweighted. So we're going to spend a bit of time looking at the 4 fundamental movements. And then, depending on what time we have remaining within this session, I'm just going to introduce maybe some additional kettlebell movements that can be done with a kettlebell. Thinking about sort of traditional resistance training exercises that you can use a kettlebell with. And it might just give you some ideas, considering we're all at lockdown and we're all at home at the moment. It just shows you how versatile this piece of kit can be, so that you can potentially use that to do some workouts for yourselves at the moment. And then if any of your clients might have some kettlebells, we might be able to give you some ideas when it comes into some other training exercises that you can do with your kettlebell. And then there's a couple more complex exercises that we can sort of introduce, but it's going to be one of the types of movements that we're probably not going to get the opportunity to coach, because it's one of the things that I would say that is probably better done in person and face-to-face, such as your Olympic lifts, which is a clean, a snatch, and a clean and jerk, for example. These are kind of complex exercises that you can get really good foundation movements with a kettlebell before you move on to a barbell. But it's probably not something that we would maybe do on Zoom. It's probably something you would leave until you're maybe getting coached face-to-face. So that's the plan of action. Predominantly, in the major time we're going to spend is in the 4 fundamental movements. And then any remaining time that we do have, we'll look through some key kettlebell additional movements that are going to be quite important. But all of this information, like I said, that I'm going to be going through today is available in the workbook, which I'll share over with you guys at the end of today's session. So that is the plan of action. Just quickly before I forget, I'll just show you what I mean by that, that workbook. So I'm just going to quickly bring that up onto the screen now. So hopefully you guys are able to see that this is the Kettlebell Confidence workbook for the workshop that we're going to be doing today. And there's how many pages I pulled together. So it's 22 pages worth of information based on the content that I'm covering today, as well as some additional information about the kettlebell, the background about the kettlebell, the functionality of a kettlebell, as well as sort of pulling together sort of an example program session with a kettlebell within there, as well as the 4 fundamental movements that we're going to be talking about and their key teaching points, pardon me, and then some traditional exercises with kettlebells, which if we've got time, we'll run through towards the end. So we'll be sharing that out at the end of today's session. So let me just bring one over to start with. So here we have a nice light kettlebell just to begin with. And just getting kind of comfortable with this sort of anatomy and kind of what you kind of call the different parts within the kettlebell itself. So you've got the sort of main traditional handle, which is where you're going to hold the kettlebell, whether it's one hand or 2 hands on the handle point at the top. And then you've got the actual horns, which are then going to connect the handle to the actual bell itself. So that's kind of the main anatomy of the kettlebell that you need to know about. And depending on what types of movements that you're going to be doing with the kettlebell, you might want to hold the kettlebell in specific ways, whether it's by the handle, by the horns, or by the bell. It'll depend on some preferences, but it's also obviously to make sure that you've kind of got the most control over the kettlebell when you're going to be doing any of the main movements. Kettlebells differ from other weighted exercises and other weighted pieces of kit because the center of gravity of the weight is very, very central. So obviously the handle sits entirely on top of the weight, which allows you to be able to move a kettlebell in slightly more functional ways than a dumbbell or a barbell, for example. If you think about a dumbbell or a barbell, the weights are on either end of the piece of kit, so it's slightly less, gets kind of slightly off balance in that kind of manner. You're holding the center of that and you've got a weight on either end, whereas the weight of the kettlebell is nice and central, which allows you to be able to kind of manipulate that and use that in slightly different ways. But it's similar, but also different, if that makes sense. Same, but a little bit different. So just kind of getting comfortable with a kettlebell as best as you can. Once you sort of buy a kettlebell, you're probably going to have that kettlebell for life. They're probably one of the sturdiest pieces of kit that you can kind of purchase in terms of any kit that you might be thinking about getting for yourselves. They're a little bit like hot cakes kind of coming straight off the press at the moment. I think everyone's trying to get a piece of kit like this to manage and survive in lockdown and make sure that you guys can kind of keep on top of your sort of fitness pursuits. But if you can get a hold of one, they're very, very versatile pieces of kit, and you can train every single body part with one piece of kit, which is a fantastic use when it comes to moving it and using it. So that's kind of the main thing. They usually go up and around about 2 kilogram jumps when it comes to kettlebells. So you usually start around about 2 kilograms, then you probably have 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. And then it starts to kind of go up from 12 kilograms and roughly around about 4 kilogram jumps. So it might go up from then 12 to 16 to then to 20 kilograms, 24, and then up towards 30 and 32 kilograms. So they can get quite heavy, but obviously it's important for you, like any other piece of kit, you need to make sure that your movement is essential and confident and competent first before you start to manipulate the movements with weight. So like anything else, the most foundational part of getting an exercise correct is making sure you've got the technique first. So technique is at the base of that pyramid before you're doing anything else. And then once you've got that technique and that base movement correct, that's when you might start to think about adding load and maybe adding speed and power and velocity through that movement. First things first is you obviously want to make sure you're getting the fundamentals right and getting the technique as kind of confident and competent as possible. So that's sort of a little introduction to anatomy. Some of that information that I've kind of discussed is going to be available in that worksheet and that workbook that I'll share over with you. So don't feel like you need to clamber and take lots and lots of notes down just now. A lot of it will get recovered in that sort of that ebook that I'll send through at the end. as well as a session, just a reminder that it will be recorded and you have got access to that in around about a week's time. So just give us time to maybe edit and upload that to share with you guys around about this time next week. So just to keep me on track, I'm just going to quickly bring this presentation back up, and then we're going to firstly look at the squat as a movement. So thinking about our squat, things we kind of want to take into account are sort of the squat fundamentals. So we want to think about this squat technique, whether it's with a kettlebell or whether it's not with a kettlebell. The first thing we want to make sure is we get a good understanding of what a good squat should look like and could look like. And it's going to be quite unique and specific to the person and the individual. In my opinion, if you're starting from baseline and someone really wants to build their squat up from the bottom up, the best thing to do is obviously do body weight squats to begin with and build that proficiency and build that confidence and competence in making sure that that client has got a really good understanding of what a good squat should be without adding any load or any other additional kind of difficulties or complexities. The next step for me, I do believe, is instead of chucking a barbell straight onto someone's back, for example, or doing anything kind of complex like that, I do believe the first introduction to do any sort of weighted squats, I think the kettlebell is a great piece of kit because it's allowing that individual to hold that piece of kit, whatever's the most comfortable for them, and still be able to squat, hopefully with a good technique. Whereas a barbell back squat, for example, which is kind of the most common squat when you're then adding load, is going to add difficulties when it comes into shoulder mobility. So that's going to come into play. If you're holding load on the back, some people might not be used to having a posterior load kind of on the upper shoulders and their back. So that might be adding a couple too many challenges for the individual. So a kettlebell squat allows you to be able to manipulate and hold that kettlebell where it's the most comfortable for the individual. So I think it's that first natural progression from body weight squat into resistance and weighted squat. So just adding a little bit more resistance to make it a little bit more challenging. I think that the kettlebell is going to be one of the best introductory pieces of kit to try and add a little bit more resistance to any squat techniques. So we're going to have a little look at squat technique first, and then we're going to have a little look at some squat variations with a kettlebell. So you've got traditional squat, but we're going to be thinking about what a goblet squat is and what a front squat is with the kettlebell. So that's kind of where we're going to start. I'm going to go through that. So it's an opportunity for you to kind of watch me teach the squat technique, teach the squat variations from a distance. And then what I'm then going to do is I'm going to give you guys 5 minutes or so to practice the movements that I've went through if you have access to that at home. So just giving you guys an opportunity to practice it a little bit and take some of these main coaching points on board so you guys can get an opportunity to sort of at least not just sit and watch me for the next 2 hours. It's at least a little bit of practical aspects to it as well. I'll not be able to give much coaching points, unfortunately, or much engagement with the level of volume of people that are in the Zoom today. We've got over 80 people with us this afternoon. So it's going to be a more opportunity for you to kind of self-coach and take some of that coaching points on board as best as you can. So that's where we're going to start. Apologies if I need to kind of keep coming back and forth to the screen a little bit, just because some people might need or maybe waiting in the waiting room and I need to let them into the Zoom. So just apologies if that's the case, but I will just kind of get myself started into a space that you'll hopefully be able to see a little bit better. So first things first, when we're kind of looking at squats, as I'm just going to use a kind of poll throughout this kind of coaching points. I just need to tilt camera so that it's visible. So that should be perfect, I think. Ideal. So first thing first, before we add any load or any resistance into the movement, which is going to be a squat, we just want to make sure we get a good understanding of what the squat should look like prior to adding any load or resistance. The squat is a compound movement, and what we mean by a compound movement, it's a multi-joint movement. So if it's multi-joint, that means it's recruiting multiple muscles. And the 3 main joints that we're going to be focusing on when thinking about a squat that are going to be going through movement is going to be your ankle joint, your knee joint, and your hip joint. So that's probably where you're going to be focusing on and making sure that people have got good movement potential at the 3 joints. So that's the first thing we kind of want to have a look at. At the kind of bigger, larger movement sites, which are going to be your knee and your hip, you're going to be focusing on 3 muscles that are going to allow you to stand up from a lowered squat position. got your quadriceps at the front of the leg or the anterior of the upper leg, which are going to be responsible for the knee extension part. So if the knee's bent and you want to extend and straighten at the knee, that's going to be the quadriceps. So that's one positive from doing squats, is you're going to build muscular either endurance, strength, or hypertrophy within the quadriceps, depending on the type of load that you might be lifting and the rep range that you might be lifting. In order for you to be able to straighten at the hips, that's going to be known as hip extension. So currently bent over and like a bent hip position and a sort of closed hip position, it's going to be hip flexion. In order for me to push and drive forward, that's hip extension. You're going to be using the biggest muscles in the body, which is your glute max on either side. And then the upper hamstrings, because they cross the hip as well, are going to be driving you through to hip extension. So they're the kind of main muscles that are going to be involved in the squat exercise prior to us adding any load, which is going to be through a kettlebell today. And then the last bit that's going to be happening is you're going to have a little bit, when you come down into a squat position, when you come down into a lower position, you'll see that my ankle needs to go into what's called dorsiflexion. So I need to be bringing myself into this dorsiflex position, which is when I'm closing my ankle joint. So in order for me to kind of get back up into an upright position, there'll be a small degree of plantar flexion, which is going to be your gastrocnemius and your soleus. But you're not necessarily coming up onto your toes. So it's not a full range of motion at the ankle joint, but it will be 3 movements that are happening during a squat: ankle, knee, and the hip, but big, large movements at the knee and the hip. So the things that we need to make sure that we're taking into account to the best of our ability is we want to make sure that we're trying to keep our back as straight as possible. So we want to make sure that our core is fully embraced and fully engaged throughout that entire movement. So when you're coming down, you want to try and keep that back as straight as possible so that you can kind of maintain good posture throughout any movement, whether you're loaded or unloaded with that squat. So again, I'm sure you guys are aware of that when you're squatting, the importance of keeping that spine in a nice strong position. It shouldn't be too far forward flexed. It shouldn't be going through extension, especially when you start to think about adding load into that movement. And the last little thing that's worth thinking about when it comes to squatting, some people have got this kind of real issue with the knee not being able to track over your toes, and the knee should always maybe stay behind the toes. And that's kind of, in my professional opinion, a bit of a grey area, just depending on their whole anatomy of that individual. Some people might be able to get down into quite a good squat without their knee having to track over their toes. Whereas other individuals, if they try to keep their knees behind their toes, they can no longer get further down than this potentially. So what they have to then do is compensate by leaning a little bit forward in order to get low enough into that squat. So you need to kind of take the individual into account, and it's not just as kind of black and white. It's just saying knee must stay behind toes, and that's kind of the only way it's possible to squat. You might allow that knee to track over the toe, as long as it stays nice and central in the foot and it stays over your middle toe. That should support good squat movement, and the knee might need to go in front of the big toe, and that's fine as long as it's done in a safe way. So that's that last little kind of couple coaching points when you're thinking about squatting, is making sure that when that individual is coming down, their feet position should be at least hip width apart, potentially shoulder width apart, depending on that anatomy of that individual's hip. And again, depending on their structure of the hip, they might find it quite difficult to be able to squat low enough if their toes are pointing directly forward. So what you might allow that client to do is maybe turn their toes out. If you think about a clock face, turn their toes out to around about 5 to 1, or maybe even out to 10 to 2. And what that might do is open this sort of ball and socket joint, which allows them to be able to get nice and low into a squat position. So they're the sort of fundamentals when you're thinking about coaching the squat technique, thinking about analysing that person's anatomy and how they're able to move at the ankle and at the hip. Does that allow good dorsiflexion and plantar flexion? Dorsiflexion on the way down, and then coming yourself driving back up. Does the hip anatomy allow yourself to keep your toes pointing forward? Or by manipulating that position, does that allow them to get deeper into a squat? That's something you might need to take into account when you're thinking about coaching them through that squat movement. And then other key coaching points is trying to maybe get your thigh down to parallel if possible. However, it might not be possible for every single client. So go to that comfortable range of motion, wherever that is for that individual. There's that sort of expectation within some of the health and fitness industry that the ass should go to grass, which is when you're kind of trying to get as low as possible. That's not essential. As long as you get down to parallel, you're going to get really good knee extension, which is quadricep engagement, and you're going to get really good hip engagement just by getting to parallel. If you can't get to parallel, or your client can't get to parallel, that's fine. But try and progress them to working towards that by increasing their flexibility and mobility as best as you can. So there's sort of the kind of main things you want to take into account. Thinking about, does their ankle allow them to keep their knee behind their toes? If not, just make sure that it's done safely. Make sure that the knees don't cascade in or cascade out. Just get them to track over that third toe, that big toe in the middle. And then make sure that you've got a good understanding of what their hip allows. Do they need to have toes pointing forward and a hip distance apart? Or do you need to manipulate that so that they're wider towards shoulder width apart? And do you need to kind of angle their toes so they're potentially at 5-1 or 10-2? So if they've got a good, confident and competent body weight squat, and they're able to kind of get up and down from a squat, keeping their back nice and straight, and move through these movements quite fluidly, depending on where they kind of want to have their arm positioned, then you can start to think about loading. And obviously today's is getting confident with loading with a kettlebell. So when it comes to kettlebell squats, there's a couple different variations. And like I mentioned earlier on, I think going from bodyweight squats, jumping straight onto barbell squats is quite a big ask for a large proportion of the general population, because they're not used to holding a weight posteriorly on top of their back as such. So they're not going to have the confidence to be able to kind of get down low enough, and they'll probably want to then bend forward to accommodate their center of gravity. So they're going to want to come forward to allow themselves to feel safer during that movement. So it's probably important to start considering, do you want to chuck them straight into a barbell squat, or do you want to start adding resistance in a slightly more functional and safer way that might suit that individual? And that's kind of where the kettlebell comes in. So the kettlebell is going to be a fantastic way of loading the squat anteriorly. And what we mean by that is loading the squat at the front. So there's two different ways that we can front load the squat. It's either by doing what's known as a goblet squat. The goblet squat is when you're holding the kettlebell in front, either by the handles as such. Some people like to hold it handles opposite way around. It's absolutely fine. The resistance is still in the exact same place. And some people like to hold it by the bell itself. It comes down to preference, but it also comes down to how safe the client is at manipulating that kettlebell around without dropping it. Don't want to be dropping this on your toes. That's definitely a trip to A&E. So you need to make sure that whatever way you can hold it is going to be the safest and most secure way at holding that kettlebell as close to your chest as you can. So once you've kind of found whatever starting position works best for you, you kind of keep that kettlebell as close to your chest as possible. You kind of want to have quite nice arm position, and you kind of want to make sure that you're engaging the scapula, which is the rhomboids between the scapula and your upper back muscles, to keep your upper back in a nice strong position. Because you've got this load at the front, you're going to be inclined to round forward into protrusion and sort of rounding that protracted shoulders towards the front. So you want to make sure you've got a nice retracted shoulder blade, make sure in a nice strong position, and then get a good sort of goblet squat position. And because you've got this load on the anterior, you're going to allow yourself to keep that upper back nice and strong, and you're going to probably have that little bit more confidence to get into a nice low squat. And I think throughout my time coaching with clients, I've found that 9 times out of 10, people have a better squat form when doing a front goblet squat than they would do doing a back squat, just because of that confidence and that ability to hold the weight at the front allows them to kind of sit deeper into what's called the whole of the squat, which is this position here, because they're holding that weight at the front. Whereas if you ask them to hold it towards the anterior, that sort of mechanism within the head sometimes just doesn't allow them to get down as safely and as fluidly whereas holding it at the front just gives them that little bit more safety. If it was too heavy and they needed to drop it, they can easily drop it in front of them and kind of quite nice and safely. Whereas if you need to drop a back squat, it's quite dangerous to try and step away and get away from being underneath that bar. So it's quite a good way to introduce resistance when it comes to adding resistance to squat. And that's going to be the first variation, which I've just taught, which is the goblet squat. As long as you can hold that in a nice, safe, comfortable position, keep it as close to the chest as possible, get yourself a nice, strong upper back, making sure that your rhomboids and your trapezius and your lats are engaged to give yourself that nice, big, upper, long spine. And that should stay in that position through the whole movement, engaging your core. And then from there, once you've got that kettlebell in your starting position, you're lowering down so you can get down toward parallel with the floor. And then when you're in this position, you obviously squeeze and push through the heels, squeezing in the glutes and your quadriceps to drive you back up into a fully extended position. So that's the goblet squat. The other variation, which can be done with a kettlebell quite easily, is called a front squat or a front rack squat. And a front rack squat is when you have the kettlebell resting upon your shoulder. So I'm just going to come down here. So you'll see that this is my elbow here. And from the side, it'll look a little bit, from the front, sorry, it'll look a little bit like this. So the kettlebell itself is in a front rack position. You can see that my humerus is nice and parallel to my shoulders. My hand is underneath on the handle, gripping it and holding it in place. And the bell of the kettlebell is just resting on basically the top towards the back of that ball and socket joint. So it's kind of nice and rested there. And with this again allows me to sort of manipulate and load this kettlebell squat in a slightly different way. And it gets used to you holding anything in what's called a front rack position. So this is going to give you good stabilization of your shoulder and kind of improving that sort of shoulder stabilization strength. But it's going to be quite a good introductory movement before you then maybe get involved in any of the Olympic lift movements. So it's going to be quite a good movement to think about. From here, you might want to use your other arm as a bit of a balance aid. And again, it's the same coaching points when it comes to the squat itself, but you're just making sure that this elbow, like a laser, stays nice and high so you can keep that upper back nice and strong. If you let that dip down, you've got that susceptibility to kind of curve in the upper back. So it's making sure that you've got a nice, strong, held kettlebell front rack position if you want to introduce that movement. So the first sort of kettlebell squat movement I would suggest is going to be the goblet squat, because it's easier to hold and it's easier to get rid of the kettlebell just in case anything went wrong. And you're still going to be working the exact same movements and exercises as all of the other exercises. And then you can think about progressing to that front rack position. And if you're going to do, let's say, an even amount of reps and sets, just make sure you split the time between left and right shoulder if your joints allow you to do that, just to make sure you're not just spending the whole time working on the one shoulder. So what I'd like you guys to do is just take a couple of minutes to start thinking about day 2 squat variations. So thinking about the goblet squat and the front squat. If anyone does have any burning questions at this point, I might be able to answer a few, but just chuck them into the chat and I can maybe answer a couple just depending if anyone does have any questions. But other than that, I'm just going to give you guys a couple of minutes just to practice day 2 variations and just start to think about how that squat variation works for you. Does it help you get lower into a squat? How does it feel for you? Which of the 2 squat variations might be more comfortable for you as an individual? And just start to have a little play around with that. Again, the coaching points of the squat don't change. The squat changes, stays the same. It's just the actual load that you're holding and the way that you're holding that squat in terms of where you're holding that load. But 9 times out of 10, I usually find that my clients would have a nicer looking goblet squat than they would have a barbell back squat when they're introducing themselves to any resistance squats to begin with. Cool. So 2 secs, just asking the chat coming up. So it's the bell and sort of the crook of the arm or sort of on the shoulder. So in terms of the actual bell itself, again, just quickly bring the presentation down. I'm guessing when this is for the front rack position, you're going to hold the kind of under with a sort of prone grip, and I just find it kind of comfortably sits either in the crook of the arm, depending on the size of the bell, but some bells will be too big for that, and you might then need for it to kind of sit and rest comfortably on top of the shoulder. This will all be specific to your shoulder mobility when it's in this sort of fixed position. But as you can see, that's just literally resting on the top of my ball and socket joint, on the top of my deltoid, rather than in the crook of the arm. Because in the crook of the arm, that's going to put a lot more force on the actual humerus. Whereas if you try and rest it on top of the sort of meaty part of your deltoid, it's not going to be putting force through that bone. It's just going to be putting vertical force straight down through the body. So preference would be for it to sit kind of on that top of that meaty point, if you can, if your shoulder flexibility allows. If not, try and have a little manipulation and just see where you can hold it as comfortable as possible. So again, a little bit of a recap on sort of squat mobility, and then thinking about how we can start to introduce resistance when it comes to thinking about squats. So that was a kind of introductory exercise for us. And hopefully you got a little chance to practice that a little bit. So remembering your sort of main squat technique, the squat technique doesn't necessarily change. It kind of stays the same. And try and work towards making that as perfect as you can when you then add the resistance. So do we have to squat deeper than 90 degrees angles in a normal squat? It's kind of squat to kind of push to the bottom, the back, so it's kind of over your knees or over heels. So ideally, the optimal angle is just to try and get your thigh down to parallel with the floor, if possible. This is all going to be case by case, and it's going to be specific to yourself and then specific to your clients. The reason we want to get down to parallel to the floor, if we can, and what I mean by that is getting your actual thigh to parallel. So again, if I bring the broom back in and use this by my thigh, currently at around about 45 degrees, and then parallel to the floor. I know my back's not in a good position here, but this is just because I'm holding the broomstick. That's going to get really good quadricep, glute, and hamstring activation. Whereas if you only go down to, let's just say 45 degrees here, you're not going to get the same recruitment of the three muscles which you want to recruit during the squat. That's the kind of purpose of the squat, is to get really proficient at using your quads, hamstrings, and glutes. So obviously, the lower you can get down by doing a safe technique will allow you to recruit more of the three muscles. The less or the lower the angle you can reach, the less recruitment you're going to get throughout the full muscle fibers. But that's just going to be specific to the individual and their anatomy and what they're able to do within that. And again, go to your comfortable depth. And then if there's still issues with that, that might be maybe even seeking a physiotherapist to have a little look at your ankle and your hip mobility, just to try and see if they can support you to potentially improve that. Okay. Exercise number 2. Because we want to probably going to spend most of the time thinking about our swing and our Turkish get up, if I'm being honest. So thinking about the deadlift technique, and then we're going to have a look at some of the deadlift variations. Okay, so when we're thinking about the deadlift technique, we'll quickly remind ourselves of what we're looking to do with that. It's going to be fairly similar to the squat because it's exact same joint actions that are occurring during a deadlift and a squat. But you're going to be pulling from the floor rather than kind of maybe pushing from the floor, but still same joint actions and same muscles that are getting recruited. You've kind of got traditional deadlift, but it's with a kettlebell, which is slightly different from a barbell deadlift. You then got what you class as like a suitcase deadlift or a single arm deadlift when you have the kettlebell out to your side and laterally. You can then do single leg deadlifts and you can do Romanian deadlifts. So we're going to have a little look at these deadlift variations. And we're just going to have a little think about some of the main coaching points for you guys when it comes to making sure that you guys have got good technique for your deadlift, as well as supporting your clients, and then thinking about introducing a kettlebell onto that movement. Okay, so thinking about that, bringing myself back over to the mat and bringing my kettlebells back over. Like I mentioned, loose as lace, just quickly tie that. The deadlift is going to be another compound exercise. And again, a reminder of what we're meaning, it's going to be multi-joint. Same things happening at the ankle, same things happening at the knee, and same things happening at the hip as the squat. But obviously, similar to the goblet squat and the front squat, you're usually having the weight towards the anterior. And what you usually do is the weight, if it's a barbell deadlift, you would usually bring yourself down, engage the full body at this point, and then you're going to be driving yourself up from the floor as the concentric phase, and then eccentrically lowering yourself back down. So that's kind of the traditional deadlift with a barbell. The things you want to take into account when you're then going to be maybe using a kettlebell instead, is that the kettlebell, if you're going to be doing a traditional deadlift with a kettlebell, is going to be far more central than the barbell would be. And what we mean by that is you're bringing your hands inside your knees, almost a little bit more like what's classed as a sumo squat in terms of your hand positioning, whereas a traditional deadlift, your hands are usually on the outside of your knees. So with that, you're probably going to have to accommodate by maybe widening your stance slightly. So when you're thinking about a kettlebell traditional squat, deadlift, pardon me, your feet during a traditional deadlift would probably be around about hip width. But with this, we're probably going to be coming out to around about shoulder width, just to accommodate that kettlebell being underneath your center of gravity and in the middle of your stance. So with that as well, you might need to start thinking about that person's ability to round forward at the shoulders and hold that in a kind of safe position. So it might not be a perfect movement for some clients. But again, when you then come down to collect the kettlebell in this position, similar to the squat, if I bring myself round to the side, again, you want to keep that back nice and straight and nice and long and nice and strong. And another coaching point that I sometimes push for any deadlift, in order to make sure that you're getting a really good, strong upper back position, try and think about turning your elbow sort of dips forward. I know I'm kind of protracting and moving my wrist a little bit, but the kind of more you sort of rotate that shoulder, that elbow joint forward a little bit, the more you're going to engage your lats and drive your lats into the movement. And what that's going to do is it's going to loosen any slack that you're going to have in your upper back by engaging these lats and pulling yourself in a nice, strong, upright position. So here, lats turned off, and now lats turned on. Off, so there's lots of slack. My arms are quite slack. By just rotating that elbow dip and engaging my lats, I'm turning my lats on, and I'm then going to support and keep a nice and strong upper back position. So it's going to be a nice key little coaching point that can help engaging the lats. And then from there, you're going to try and just drive and pull it up. When I'm thinking about the deadlift movements, on the way up, the first set of movements, you're going to bring yourself up to here. But on the way down, a lot of people have got quite a susceptibility to bend at the knees too early, especially with a kettlebell, because with a barbell, if you bend too early, the barbell has to come in and out as so. So if you're bending your knees too early on the way down, you then got to try and drive that barbell forward and then bring it back into the leg. Whereas with a kettlebell, it's easier just to keep the kettlebell underneath, and you can sort of bend your knees too early. The main coaching point in the lowering phase for myself is that it's hips first, and you've really got to get comfortable with that hip hinge movement when you're doing it with resistance. That's going to be very transferable to anybody that's going to be doing kettlebell swings. So you can see that my knees still stay fully extended. I've got no bend in the knee. It's all movement at the hip, and then I come down. So I don't bend at my knee until I've got my kettlebell past my knee joint. And it's the same on the way up. I extend at the knees first and then drive through at the hips. So it's almost hips, knees, knees, hips. So thinking about on the way down, on the way up, it's quadriceps, quadriceps, glutes and hamstrings. And then glutes and hamstrings, quadriceps controlling you back down. So that's going to be a traditional deadlift. Coaching points are much the same, except you're just really trying to get a really good, comfortable position and holding that kettlebell essentially. So again, nice strong back, elbow dips turn forward as so, allowing me to get a nice strong upper back, driving up, hips go back, then down with my knees. I'm obviously exaggerating that slowing down of my pace, but you will find that over time, once you get comfortable with the kettlebell, you can get a good sort of fluid movement between the two. And that's a traditional deadlift with a kettlebell. And the reason we wanted to introduce the squat and the deadlift is you can start to see how some of these movements are going to transfer into that kettlebell swing, which we're going to come on to shortly. So it's really important to get a good understanding of that. A couple of different exercises and variations that you can do with a kettlebell when it comes to deadlift is you can do what's known as the suitcase deadlift or the single arm deadlift, which is when you have the kettlebell laterally and you do the same sort of movement. You could do that single arm, which is going to put a little bit more emphasis in your core, keeping yourself nice and upright and nice and straight. You could do it double arm. I know that these are slightly different weights, but if they were the same weight, again, you can do double arm, what's called suitcase deadlifts. Again, you can see how that's quite a functional exercise, coaching to bring and lift some suitcases or some bags of shopping up off the floor. So the coaching points are going to be the exact same. You're just going to be manipulating where the kettlebell is. You're going to be working the exact same muscles, but just adding a slightly different angle to it to make things a little bit challenging in a different way. Some other variations, if you've maybe not got, you want to add a little bit more resistance, but you find that the resistance that you've got doesn't really work both legs at the same time. It's not going to be heavy enough. And you want to do what's called a unilateral movement. You can sort of do deadlifts, which are going to be single leg as well. So you've got the Romanian deadlift, which is keeping a slight bend in the knee. And all I'm doing is lowering down to my comfortable range of motion. And I'm putting more emphasis, not on the quadriceps, but just purely hamstring and glute. So that's going to be working both sides. That's a bilateral movement, working both sides at a time. So you can see that I'm not reaching the floor because I'm not bending at the knee. And that's known as a stiff leg or a Romanian deadlift. But you can do that single leg as well. So if I hold the kettlebell in my right hand, I'm then going to do a single leg Romanian deadlift on my left leg. So all I'm going to do is lower myself down, place an emphasis on this left leg, and then Romanian deadlift single leg. So again, that's kind of unilateral movement, working one side at a time. And again, that's going to put a bit of an emphasis on coordination and balance. And again, I would kind of bring myself around to the other side. And whatever you do on one side, you're going to do on the other. Again, focus on keeping that back nice and strong, that spine nice and long. And that's called a single leg Romanian deadlift. Again, adding a bit more core functionality and core engagement into that exercise, and just thinking about how you can manipulate it differently with a kettlebell than you could with a barbell, for example. So it's just a quick opportunity to have a little practice of the deadlift movements before we move on to sort of the bigger movement, which is the kettlebell swing, sorry. So have a little practice of the movements: traditional deadlift, suitcase deadlift, Romanian deadlift, and then single arm Romanian deadlift, which means you're going down on one leg, or single leg Romanian deadlift, probably the better way to word that. So just practicing the movements. Again, key focus is that keeping that back nice and straight. On the way up, make sure that your kettlebell is roughly in line with your knees before you start pushing forward at the hips. And then on the way down, it's the opposite. Make sure that your hips go back first. And then once the kettlebell starts to pass your knees, that's when it's comfortable to start bending at your knee. Keep your back nice and straight throughout. And just see which of them is most comfortable for you. You might be more comfortable with the traditional deadlift with the kettlebell between your legs. Your shoulder and your back position might be not perfect there. So you might feel more comfortable by shifting that kettlebell laterally and then doing what's called the suitcase deadlift. So have a little play around with both and see what works best for you. Then try the Romanian deadlift. And the Romanian deadlift is when you're keeping a slight small bend in the knee, but then it's full hip hinge movement. So you're really just sort of bending forward at the hips, loading your hamstrings and glutes. So go to that point of range of motion where your back stays nice and straight. However, you really start to feel that activation within your glutes and your hamstrings. So some people will be able to reach to the floor and the kettlebell will touch the floor, whereas other people will not. And again, that's just all dependent on your range of motion with the kettlebell and with your hamstrings, sorry. And then lastly, once you've got comfortable with just the double leg Romanian deadlift, try a couple of single legs and just try testing your proprioception, your balance. So kettlebell goes in one hand and then you keep the opposite leg straight. So whatever hand you've got your kettlebell in, it's the opposite leg that you're working. So try and send that other leg back and keep your back nice and strong and allow that kettlebell to stay particularly right underneath and in line with your standing leg, and use that hamstring and glutes on one leg to drive yourself back up. So just someone asking about the elbow joint and kind of what I was looking for. So give me 2 secs, I'll just quickly show you that. And then weight more to the heels. Yeah, same with the squat as well. You really want to be manipulating that weight to the heels when you're driving up through all of the movements. So you really wanted to kind of focus on that. And I'll just quickly bring the presentation down. So what I mean, so that's kind of a traditional position with my elbow joint. So I'm not quite switched that, but by turning my elbow dips round, what that's doing is turning and activating my lats. So that elbow dip starts to rotate forward, but it's not necessarily anything that's happening at the elbow. It's through pure activation at my lats, which is then going to allow for me to have a nice, strong back position. So elbows currently pointing in to face each other. By then turning my lats on, I then need to kind of rotate that shoulder and that elbow joint through to activate my lats and be able to pull that back up. So that's what I mean by just kind of rotating. The coaching points, the movement's not necessarily happening at the elbow, but the coaching point with the elbow sometimes helps manipulate that. And just someone asking to show that one-legged deadlift again, that's absolutely fine. With one-leg deadlift, so my left leg is going to be the one that I'm working. I hold the weight in my right hand. And then what I do is I load the hamstrings and glutes on my left leg, elevate and lift my right foot, keep my center of gravity nice and balanced. And all I'm doing is loading the hamstrings and glutes on my left leg, keep that back and arm and leg, everything nice and straight. And then squeezing with my glutes and my hamstrings on my left leg, I drive myself back through to an upright position. I'll just quickly switch hands and switch legs just so you can see. So now working the right leg. So my left hand is holding the weight. Load that hamstring and glute on my right. Keep that back. And sorry, my balance went there. Keep that back nice and straight as best as you can. And you can see that my eyes just follow wherever my back is. My back goes down, my eyes go down. My back comes up, my eyes come up. And that pretty much happens through every single deadlift movement. So down, I'm facing the floor, I'm facing forward, I'm back facing the floor. So I keep my neck in line with my back throughout the movement. Some people are quite guilty for really straining and extending at the neck when they're working through some of the kettlebell movements or deadlift movements. Okay, so the next movement is going to be the kettlebell swing. And like I say, we're probably going to spend the most of the time here, and then we'll finish off with the Turkish get up, just looking at the sort of time that we've got available. So when it comes to the kettlebell swing, there's some fundamental things that we want to take into account. So we're going to go through the theory of the kettlebell swing, and then I'm going to show you what I mean, and then I'm going to get you guys to start practicing it, just for a little bit. So when it comes to the kettlebell swing, it's important to remember that it's not a squat or a frontal raise. The kettlebell swing is a fundamental and fluid movement. It's not two individual movements. So some people are quite guilty for doing squat, then frontal raise, which is going to be a leg then shoulder exercise, when the kettlebell swing is an entirely lower body explosive movement. All the arms and the shoulders are doing are acting as a lever to help the kettlebell swing. Your upper body shouldn't really be influencing that kettlebell and pulling that kettlebell up from the floor. It's all through explosive driving of your hip joint to try and explosively push that kettlebell forward, and all your arms are like as a lever supporting that movement to occur. It's not a remaining deadlift swing, so some people have the tendency not to bend at the knee, which is then going to limit your hamstring contraction if you're keeping that hamstring locked out and keeping that leg in a sort of static position. And it's necessary to allow a little bit of a knee bend to then support you accessing your hamstrings through hip extension. So it is important to take that into account as well. Height doesn't matter. Some people always think that the higher their kettlebell swing, the better it is. Trying to swing to a certain height or a certain target too quickly can sometimes result in you using other parts of the body that you're not meant to, which can put them through a compromising position. So it's important that you don't focus too much on the height to begin with, and it's more just a sign of how the height is more a sign of how aggressive your hips are. Where sometimes people focus on trying to get that really high swing straight away, but they've not got the hip aggressiveness and the hip contraction right. So they're then having to accommodate that by using upper body muscles, when actually the height is all down to how powerful your hip can be. So if you've not quite got that hip movement, I wouldn't expect your kettlebell swing to be that high until you start to really influence that hip movement and get a really good solid contraction. American is not always better. So sometimes there's two classifications when it comes to a kettlebell. You've got what's known as the Russian kettlebell swing, which is when you swing the kettlebell up until around about eye level. And then you've got some which are known as the American kettlebell swing, which is when you swing the kettlebell entirely over your head. So American's not always better. Americans, apologies if anyone is American, but I think Americans sometimes get associated to be everything is always bigger and better. And the American kettlebell swings the same. So they swing the kettlebell entirely overhead, which is problem number one. So if you've not got pure control of the kettlebell and it then goes over your head, you're putting yourself at a slight risk of any injury. And if your shoulder mobility is not great, you can then compensate by having to arch in your lower back, which again, you're then going to be putting velocity and power through your lower back whilst there's load through the kettlebell, which is going to be a danger point for your lower back as well. So that height is something that's only going to come through practice and through competence with the kettlebell swing. Begin with, you might not even get up to shoulder width, and that's absolutely shoulder height, pardon, that's absolutely fine. But as you get more powerful and more confident with it, that's when the swing will then drive the kettlebell up until around about hip to eye level, shoulder to eye level, sorry. So there's sort of this kind of main fundamentals that are important to take into account. So just quickly before I move on to the next slide. So what we mean by what it's not, I'll just quickly do that. So it's not a squat, frontal raise. That's two independent movements that's occurring. So we've got to try and avoid that. And we've got to remember that the kettlebell swing is entirely driven by triple extension at your ankles, knees, and your hips. So that's kind of what the kettlebell is not. And you've got to try and make sure that the arms pretty much just stay as a lever and just allow the kettlebell swing to come from the hips. And the arms just act as guiding the kettlebell up and down through its safe directional path. So that's kind of the most important thing. Again, height doesn't matter. Height's just a pure relationship with how aggressive you can get your kettlebell swing to be. So some people have got this adamant feeling that it's got to go above head. But this height of your kettlebell swing is all going to come through practice and how confident you are at driving through at the hips. So it's being able to break up the movements to make sure that you're not putting yourself at danger of any injury. So the kettlebell swing cues that I always look for when I'm coaching any clients through the kettlebell exercises are as follows. And these are going to be available in the workbook that I share with you guys later. So the things that I'm looking for is triple extension. So remember that it's a lower body exercise. So all of the power and all of the movement is going to be coming from your ankle, knees, but predominantly an aggressive hip drive is going to really be where the main power source is going to be coming from when you're doing your kettlebell swing. So my tip and cue is think about doing a standing broad jump. And what we mean by that is, again, sorry, I'm just kind of bringing the slides up and down. A standing broad jump is if I was to ask you guys to get into your strongest jumping position, you're probably going to have your feet about shoulder width apart. And I'm then going to ask you if you were to try and jump as far forward and broadly as possible. That is basically what you're doing within the kettlebell swing. So it's like a standing broad jump without actually leaving the floor. So I'm coming down and I'm driving up as aggressively as possible without actually leaving the floor. So imagine I'm wanting to do a broad jump, but instead I'm just really focusing on keeping my back nice and strong and nice and long. And I'm just trying to do that aggressive broad jump, but without leaving the floor. And that's going to get that pure triple extension at your ankle, your knee, and your hips. So again, that's something we're going to probably imagine doing before we even touch the kettlebell. I'm going to get people really confident and comfortable with almost performing a standing broad jump without the actual jump part. If they can get that really explosive movement, imagine they want to try and jump as far as they can forward, but without actually leaving the floor. That's kind of going to be that triple extension that I look for at your ankle, your knees, and your hips. Your starting position, again, I'd ask you, like, if I'm going to get you to do a standing broad jump, stand in what you feel is your most powerful position. So your feet are going to naturally come a little bit wider than your hip stance. So they're going to probably come out towards your shoulder. And again, same as what we've done for the deadlift. So you can see how some of these coaching points start to translate. Elbow pits start to come forward when you go down to collect that kettlebell. And that just means that you engage your upper back and you keep your abs tight and your lats tight, and you keep them tight throughout the exercise. So that means that your upper back stays nice and strong. Your abs are engaged, keeping your spine nice and long. And that's you then in a good starting position. So we're going to coach that starting position before we even touch the kettlebell in a second. When you then want to pull from the floor, it's important to all that starting position stuff that we've just went through. So getting that standing broad jump position, maybe practicing the standing broad jump without the leap, getting yourself imagining that explosive drive, elbow pits forward, abs nice and tight. When you're holding onto the kettlebell, channel all of the coaching points in when you collect the kettlebell, and then that's a good starting position for us to start from. It's then I put down hut. So imagine you are an American footballer, and what you're doing in order to get yourself into that starting position, the kettlebell should be at the front, and I ask you to, like, almost like an American footballer would, drive the kettlebell back through your legs with the lats, and that's going to be starting that momentum. Imagine you were like an American footballer, like I say, you shout hut, and you try to drive the American football back through your legs. But obviously we're going to be replacing the American football with a kettlebell, and that's all going to be ensuring that you have a nice pull through your legs. But the important thing is to make sure you've got your abs tight and your lats tight. And that's how you're going to start the motion with getting the kettlebell moving. And then once you've pulled that kettlebell back through your legs, that's where the momentum starts. So once the kettlebell naturally starts to want to come back forward like a pendulum, that's when you start your swing. And that's when that standing broad jump example comes into count. And you almost try and stand up as strongly, aggressively, and powerfully, and as hard and straight as you can without leaving the floor. And if you can channel that aggression into your kettlebell swing, that's then going to allow you to stand up strong. That's going to drive that kettlebell forward. And your arms are just going to be like a lever guiding that kettlebell through the air until it gets to the point where it's roughly at the top of the swing. And almost within that last sort of 10 to 15 degrees of travel, the kettlebell should almost feel weightless as it travels through the air. And then once it starts to pick up its weight again, that's when you then have to follow the next coaching point, which is let the bell fall down naturally. Don't bend forward too early. Allow your biceps to come to your torso and then start to bend forward. Some people start to bend forward too early and their arms are still out in front of them. So they're going to compromise their back by putting it in an unsafe position. So once the kettlebell's traveled up to its natural height, whatever that is, allow biceps to come back down to your torso. And then once your biceps start to touch your torso, that's when you can start to bend forward again. So again, another kind of coaching point that I always want to try and make sure we do, follow that momentum back through the legs, like that footballer, the kettlebell goes back to the legs, and then you start to aggressively stand back up. And that's how you start to chain repetitions together. Okay. So we're going to have a little look at these three positions. We're going to make sure we get the standing position right, the pull from the floor right, and then the swing aggressively right. And then we'll start to try and chain some repetitions together in a second. Some final cues which will be available for you in your workbook. Apologies, this might be a little bit smaller on your screen, but important to make sure you keep a tense upper body throughout. Your upper body is not driving or pulling the kettlebell. It's only a lever, and it should be a sturdy lever by keeping your lats engaged and your abs engaged. So tighten up your core and set your lats. Avoid any rounding. So a tight core is essential to avoid rounding at your upper back or worse, your lower back throughout this movement. So try and maintain that stiffness throughout your torso by keeping your abs and your lats tight. Remember that the body is going to follow the kettlebell. So wherever the kettlebell goes, the body will follow. So kettlebell, as it comes back through the legs, that's when you're going to drive forward with that hip extension. As the kettlebell comes back down and your arms and your torso, your biceps start to touch your torso, that's when you're going to follow the legs or follow it back through your legs, pardon me. Imagine the arms are like a rope attached to the kettlebell. So you've got no musculature within your hands and your arms. They don't do anything except you've tied your arms onto the kettlebell. And imagine you're just using the kettlebell, so your arms like a rope in order to swing that kettlebell back and forward. So you shouldn't be using the arms to facilitate the movement. The arm should stay just loose to guide the kettlebell through the air. So keep them loose and fully relaxed and allow all your hip movement to be translated through your shoulders and your arms to allow that movement to occur. When you're standing up, think about two things: aggressively standing up and squeezing your bum and squeezing your glutes. Explosively, and I mean really, really exaggerate that glute squeeze to imagine that you're driving and jumping off the floor without your heels or your toes leaving the floor, and your torso should naturally pop up, and then the kettlebell should follow, like your arms being a rope, allowing that pendulum to swing forward. And really, as I say, focus on squeezing those cheeks. Don't let your lower back drive the movement. Use your glutes to drive you up and stand you up. It should be a powerful glute squeeze, as if you're doing a hip thrust, but standing up, and really feel those glutes working. And remember to breathe. Exhale forcefully as you drive the kettlebell out of the hole and forward. And remember to breathe in as the kettlebell starts to come back. It's an explosive movement, so that exhale can sometimes help channel the power into the swing. So these coaching points are going to be available to you within your coaching manual. We're now going to look through the three specific points, and it's going to be really good, translatable, especially for anyone that swings their kids around, swings their kids through their legs up and down. Someone's just mentioned golf. That's probably a far more functional movement rather than swinging kids back and forth. But we'll start with a slightly lighter kettlebell to begin with. And we get into that standing position. So we're going to coach the standing position first. So please feel free to follow me along. But I'm going to give you an opportunity. If you want to watch this, I'm going to give you an opportunity in a second to practice what I'm coaching. So the first thing we want to do is get that starting position right. So feet roughly around about shoulder width apart. And I feel if I remove that kettlebell, this is probably my strongest broad jump position. So if I want to do that broad jump, I feel that this is probably my strongest position. And that's going to translate quite well into my explosive drive without leaving the floor. So I'll get myself into that starting position. The kettlebell is probably around about half a step in front of me, and you might not be able to see that perfectly. It's a bit kind of camouflaged with my colour of my mat, but that is half a step in front. So I then want to come down, back nice and straight, abs engaged, turn the elbow joints or elbows back through, engaging my lats, and that's me in my starting position. So you want to make sure that your client gets that nailed down first before they even think about lifting that kettlebell. So first things first, get them to be able to explosively drive up. Imagine they're doing a standing broad jump without leaving the floor. You then translate that starting stance into your kettlebell initial lift, but the setup is the most important thing first. Kettlebell slightly in front, back stays nice and long and nice and strong. Engage your core, grab the kettlebell, engage your lats, and then from this is where you start. And everything that I've just done there with my lats, with my core, stays consistent throughout the full movement. So everything that's going to happen from then on out is going to stay nice and consistent throughout the full kettlebell swing. The next thing we need to get the kettlebell or the client comfortable with is that hut movement. So imagine you're an American footballer. You want to use your lats and sort of use that to kind of drive that kettlebell back into that first swing, so you can then start to think about driving it forward. So just getting that kettlebell, that client comfortable with keeping that back nice and straight, but pulling that kettlebell through the back, so you can then start the momentum exercise of driving up and through. So that's the two things you want to start to get nailed down with your client before they even start to swing with the kettlebell. And then once you've got the start position and that initial pull through of the kettlebell, it's then just thinking about all the other coaching points that I've went through. And it's explosively driving up. Arms are like a rope. So I've now tied my arms like a rope to the kettlebell. They're not going to be involved in lifting anything. They're just going to be like a lever that carries and moves the kettlebell, but doesn't actually contract in any way other than holding the kettlebell. You're then going to hut, stand up explosively. Stand up explosively, as explosive as possible, and drive that kettlebell up through the air. You can see this is a 12 kilogram kettlebell, and it's moving quite quickly, and you can almost hear that it's quite a cardiovascular exercise because of the explosive driving of the hips. So I'm getting a wee bit puffed out already. So again, I'll just show you from side on. So again, that kettlebell nice in front, lats on, abs engaged, hut, and stand. Drive through and stand. And just let arms to, biceps to torso before I then start to bend forward. And then let that kettlebell fly through. And then explosively standing up. The more explosive I stand, you can see that the kettlebell just wants to swing higher and higher. And you'd actually probably be quite surprised with kind of, if you start to get quite proficient at using a kettlebell, this is obviously moving up to 20 kilograms now, you can start to see how proficient you can get. And you might actually surprise yourself with what kind of weight, as long as you're doing it safely and keeping the coaching points engaged, you can really start to get quite aggressive with it. And it's going to be a really good fundamental movement that involves lots of different muscles within the one exercise. So I'd like to give you guys a chance at practicing that just now, if you've not already done so. And what we want to get practicing are these three movements. So get your setup right. Practice that broad jump without actually jumping, and get that explosive standing up experience as comfortable as possible. So get really, really comfortable with jumping without jumping. So practice to jump from the floor, but don't leave the floor. If you can get that, then bring that in to your standing position. So shoulder width apart probably. And then once you've kind of got that shoulder width apart position, bring yourself down. Kettlebell should be about half a step in front of you. Grab the kettlebell with two hands overhand, turn on your abs and turn on your lats. That's your starting position. Then once you've got your standing jump without jumping right, you've got your starting position right, That'll allow you to start translating into the actual kettlebell swing itself. So think about that, channel your American footballer in, pull that kettlebell through to the back of the legs, and then as soon as that kettlebell starts to flow forward, that's when you stand up as aggressively as possible, driving your hips, driving your glutes, squeezing your glutes together, and that's going to drive that kettlebell forward and up. And as soon as you get that movement, that'll allow you to get really kind of comfortable with explosively stand up as aggressively as you can, and that kettlebell should swing quite naturally and quite fluidly. Ideally, eye height is probably where you want to be sort of capping your swing at. There's not going to be any major benefits to going any higher than that, other than the risk of you potentially dropping your kettlebell on your head, which is not a bonus for anyone. So eye level is probably perfect. And then once you get comfortable doing that with a lighter weight, that's when you can start to load and add resistance throughout that kettlebell swing. Again, if you're going to be moving into any complex Olympic lift movements, any cleans, any snatches, clean and jerk movements, that's all going to come through really explosive hip extension. So the kettlebell swing is a massively good fundamental baseline exercise for anyone that's looking to do any other types of weightlifting in the future. So if you can start to channel that really good aggressive kettlebell swing, that's going to be really, really good at being translatable into other areas of Olympic or weightlifting pursuits. So hopefully you found that quite useful in terms of breaking that up into different specific movements. So there's 3 things to think about when you're doing your kettlebell. Think about your setup, think about that first initial pull, and then start to think about what you can do to explosively drive up. And that's that standing broad jump without the jump. Once you've got that, once you're kind of comfortable with that and you're kind of comfortable, you can then start to think about making it a bit more coordination based and a bit more complicated. So you can start doing sort of one-handed kettlebell swings. You can then start to switch hands in midair, and you can start to make that kind of a bit more complex depending on how kind of comfortable you get. My top tip is if you're doing single-handed kettlebell deadlifts, when the kettlebell, I'm going to quickly use a lighter one just because I'm holding it. When the kettlebell doing single-handed deadlifts, when you're doing double hands, you've got to hold it in this position here, knuckles pointing forward. When you're doing single hand, just to protect your shoulder joint, it's probably not good to do a single hand because you have to rotate a little bit. You're probably not going to look after the shoulder joint too much if you keep this forward grip. So what I recommend is thumb to bum as it travels through the legs. That's going to help protect and internally rotate that shoulder joint and keep it nice and secure. So as that kettlebell is coming back through, thumb to bum, and it rotates knuckles forward, thumb to bum, knuckles forward, thumb to bum. And that's another kind of good coaching point if you're doing anything single-handed when it comes to kettlebell swings, just to protect your shoulder joint. So it's a nice, easy one to remember. So hopefully that will translate into kind of keeping that shoulder joint nice and safe for yourself and for your clients. Okay. The last fundamental exercise that I'd quite like to go through with you guys is the Turkish get up. So Turkish get up is a nice foundational exercise which will support people to feel confident getting up and off the floor under resistance, which, yes, that's not that translatable into everyday life, but if you can do it with weight, it's going to support individuals to be able to get up and off the floor without weight, which is going to be quite useful in older adulthood, just for anyone that might potentially be at risk of kind of having falls. Like, it's good to make sure that you can drill this type of fundamental movement as early as possible to help individuals get safely off the floor. But obviously, it's a really big compound exercise, which includes pretty much every single muscle within the body. So we're going to have a little look through how we can get this nice and specific. So it's called the Turkish get up. So we're going to go through the Turkish get up technique. And my main coaching points for the Turkish get up technique is make up you've got a correct setup position when you're on the floor. So the 45 degrees arm and leg is one of my main coaching points. So that's going to be something that I'm going to be looking into and drilling in a second. And then it's going to be using your core to bring you up from the floor. So the core is going to be massively engaged in driving and bringing you up from the floor into a nice, strong, stable position for you to then be able to drive up into a standing position. There's a mini glute bridge within it. So it's making sure that you're activating your glutes and you're driving through the glutes. That 45 degrees arm and leg position earlier on is going to allow us to do what I call window wiper legs, which is when you sweep your leg through the gap that you've created. But if you do not set up at 45 degrees, you're going to find that far more challenging. You're then lunging from the floor up into a standing position, and then you're repeating all of the movements in reverse to bring yourself back down to the floor. So I'm going to show you guys what that looks like, and then going to get you guys to do it unweighted on your left and your right. And then if you feel you would like to do it weighted, we'll then practice that. But the first thing I'd like you to do is just try and potentially watch me first. Someone just asked, single arm swings, do you swap midair? No, you do not have to swap midair. It's just making that exercise more complex. So you can do one arm for 10 reps, then you can put the kettlebell down and do another arm for 10 reps. Or if you feel you want to add more complexity, the next step up would be swapping hands mid-air. It's completely up to you, and you should always have a rationale as to why you're asking yourself or your clients to do that. Is that translatable into your everyday, or are you just doing it because it looks good? So have a little think about that. So for the Turkish get up, I'm going to quickly talk you through the coaching points quickly. And then I'll get you guys to follow me through, and then I'll get you guys to do it a couple of times if you want. And then if you want to try it weighted, you can try it weighted. So the best way to probably coach this is I'm going to change my mat just around to kind of face you guys first. And I'm just going to make sure, yep, you can see my legs and you can see me here. So in this position, I would have the leg that's going to be holding the kettlebell up in what's called A-frame position. And I would be holding the kettlebell in my right hand. So this is my starting position. Kettlebell would be here. The supporting leg where the weight is going to come up into A-frame. So that's the starting position with the weighted side. For the unweighted side, I need leg and arm to be at least at 45 degrees. If it's out towards 90, it's probably not going to be quite as stable. And if it's any closer to the body, you're going to see how it might get complex when you're going through the exercise. So 45 degrees, 45 degrees, that would be 90, that would be 0, that's 45. So this is my starting position, and I need to make sure that you get a good understanding that this is where, whether you're on left or right, they're the kind of main coaching points you need to know. A-frame, weighted arm, 45 degrees, 45 degrees. And this is your starting position, okay? So when we're in the starting position, remember the next coaching point is this core that's going to bring you up from the floor, and your core muscles, which is your rectus abdominis that runs down the front, as well as your obliques, are going to help pull you up onto your elbow and then pull you up onto your hand. So I'm now in this sort of staggered seated position with my hand supporting here, and the weight would still be up in this elevated position. I've got my A-frame leg that's not moved and my 45-degree leg that's not moved, okay? This is when the mini glute bridge comes in. So the glute bridge is a drive via your glutes to drive you up and off the floor. So what I've now done is I've created a gap for me to then be able to do what I call window wiper legs, swing that leg through. If I go back to that 45-degree leg earlier, like I talked about earlier on, and let's just say I've got it at around about 0 degrees. I then bring myself up here. I then get stuck somewhere in here, and I've then got to sort of wriggle myself through, which is a far more dangerous position when you've got a weight elevated above your body. So 45 degrees is essential, at least, to be able to swing that leg through and under, and then I can drive myself up with my core, pushing myself up into this bottom lunge position, and then I can lunge up to the start. I then have to do the exact same movements, but in reverse. So I lunge back, take myself down, hand goes down to the floor, I window wiper back through to 45 degrees, slowly reverse my glute bridge, down to my elbow, and then back down to my starting position. And that's one rep. So Turkish get-ups are hard. So that's kind of on one side. I'll do the same on the other, but with a kettlebell. You really want to be starting as light as you can with this movement and build up weight as slowly as possible to make sure you're kind of nice and proficient in the exercise. Definitely don't start with heavy weight. So again, I'll just shimmy myself up and I'll do it this way and then I'll slightly change the angle for the next one. So again, A-frame, same side as the weighted movement, the sort of weighted arm, pardon me, 45 degrees, core from the floor, up onto my elbow, and then up onto my hand. Glute bridge, keeping my sort of gaze probably entirely on the kettlebell throughout. Window wiper leg, drive up into the bottom of a lunge, and then drive up into a standing position. Lunge back, lunge to the floor, gaze on the kettlebell throughout, hands down to the floor, window wiper back through whilst I'm taking my mat, lower down, elbow to floor, and then back down. I mean, that's only 6 kilograms, but it's definitely challenging enough to add a little bit of extra stress into that movement. I'm just going to quickly show you from a slightly different angle, just in case you need. So again, hopefully you can see me okay. Weighted arm on the left-hand side, 45 degrees. Using my core to bring me up from the floor, up onto my elbow, then up onto my hand. Mini glute bridge, window wiper through, driving up with the glutes, quadriceps, glutes, hamstrings, driving me up. Step back, lower down, hand down to the side, window wiper through, lower back down, elbow, shoulders, and then you can lower the weight. And that's 1 repetition, like I say, up and down. Challenging sort of movement, quite a compound movement using multiple points of the body. So it's thinking about how you can sort of manipulate that and kind of go with that as best as you can. So in terms of where do you go to do a half Turkish get up, you would just literally stop at the top, get yourself back down to the floor, swap hands, and then start from the floor, working your way back up. So a Turkish get up can either be halved in any way. You can either start from the standing position and work your way down, put the weight down, stand back up, and then start again. Or vice versa. You can probably more commonly start from the floor and then stand yourself up, place the weight back down on the floor, you then get yourself back down to the floor, and you would then repeat the movement from the floor, but on the opposite side. So what I would quite like you guys to do is, I'd like you to get yourself on the floor for me, and I'm going to talk you through an unweighted Turkish get up if you want to try one. So whether you pick, let's just put our left leg into A-frame and our left leg above our body. So left leg into A-frame and left leg above your body. And then you want to put your right leg and your right arm to 45 degrees so that you're now in your starting position. So if you can't see your screen, I'm down on the floor now. You should look something like myself. Left hand up in the air, left leg in A-frame, right hand and right arm out in 45 degrees. You now want to use your core to bring you from the floor. So using your core muscles, this is unweighted at the moment, bring yourself up onto your elbow. So that's rectus abdominis and obliques, and then do the same to bring yourself up onto your hand. You're now in this sort of position to start driving up from the quads, the glutes, pardon me, and doing your mini glute bridge. So you're now in this sort of staggered position, which should allow you to window wiper through with that leg and drive and kind of push from your hand and push through your hips, bring yourself up into this lower Turkish get up position, drive yourself up. That would be half a Turkish get up. If you want to do the reverse, you can follow me back through. Lunge back with your right leg, lower that knee to the floor, untuck your toes. Hands going to now come down to the floor. Window wiper that leg back through. Lower your bum and your hips down to the ground. Lower your elbow to the ground and your shoulders to the ground. Shake that off if you feel you'd like to. Switch sides. and I'll kind of coach you through the other side. I'll probably not do it, but I'll just talk you through. So again, A-frame right leg, right arm should be above the body now. Left arm and left leg should be at 45 degrees. At this position, you're now going to use core to take you from the floor, bring you up onto your elbow, then up onto your hand, mini glute bridge, window wiper that leg through, come into the lower lunge position, and then lunge up to the standing start. That's half Turkish get up. If you want to reverse it, lunge back with that left leg, knee to the floor, untuck your toes, hand down to the floor, which is your left hand, window wiper that leg back through to 45 degrees, lower your leg or your hips down to the floor, lower that elbow, and then lower your shoulder blades down to the floor and give yourself a little rest and let yourself a little shake. So that's us coached and talked through that unweighted. And I was always recommend coaching that unweighted before you then do a kettlebell lift. So then we're now going to start thinking about doing one with a kettlebell if you would like. So if you've got a light kettlebell, as light as possible, even a water bottle or a light dumbbell is absolutely fine. But the kettlebell is easiest to manipulate and hold if you've got a light kettlebell. To try that. Can you show me the hand directions on the kettlebell for the Turkish get up? So basically, the entire time I'm going through this Turkish get up, my knuckles are facing the sky in this position. The kettlebell rests on the back of my wrist as so, and it stays in this position throughout the entire movement if you can. Your eyesight should be on this kettlebell throughout the entire kettlebell movement. So 45 degrees left with my leg and my arm. I bring myself up, still in the same position. I bring myself up, still in the same position. I bring myself up here, through, drive, and up. So that kettlebell has always been resting on the back of my wrist. My palms facing forward, and I'm obviously having an overhand grip on the handle. I'm then going to reverse that movement, lunge back, down, hand, untuck the toes, drive the leg through, and back down. So you can see that the kettlebell itself stays in this rested position on the back of my wrist throughout the entire movement. And you would do the same obviously on both sides. So it's just resting on the back of my wrist, overhanded grip, gripping as so. And that gives you a nice strong purchase and keep a nice hold on the kettlebell. And the idea, to make it as challenging as possible, you should keep your eyesight on the kettlebell throughout the entire Turkish get up, if you can. So keeping your sight on the Turkish get up, on the kettlebell throughout the entire standing up and going back down. So just resting, I'll just bring it a little bit closer so you can see. Just resting that on the back of the wrist and hand over. And that's fairly challenging in terms of, there you go, first ever Turkish get up. That's what I like to hear. So it's just trying to get as confident, as competent with that as possible. The coaching points are going to be available for you guys for keeps as well. This video is going to be available, so it will get shared out in about a week's time. So fantastic, well done. And it seems 6th step, is it better to count each ideally or keep on watching the kettlebell at all times? It depends. Again, my answers are always it depends, but it just depends what kind of going to work best for you. I always find that just kind of breaking up into small digestible chunks is just going to support you to kind of keep focusing on each movement. But if you need to take a sort of pause throughout the movements and break up into any way you need to, then that's absolutely fine. I'm sure you guys, once you've done it a couple of times, you'll start to feel just like the kettlebell swing. The heart rate definitely gets elevated, and it's quite a challenging exercise. But you can see how functional it could potentially be. Chuck that in at the end of a workout to really get a little bit of a final blast before you finish up. And I'm sure you'll not thank me for it, but it's definitely challenging. So they were the 4 fundamental movements that I really wanted to try and hone in with you guys within this workshop. So the first movement, the squat, is a fundamental movement that's going to allow you to safely get up and off the floor. from a seated position, pardon me, which is going to be really important to kind of focus in on. And then we focused in on the sort of deadlift. And you can start to see how the squat and the deadlift would translate into just everyday life, but also some of the coaching points that we used during the squat and then some of the coaching points that we used within the deadlifts then translated into our kettlebell swing, such as turning on the lats. The abs are always engaged, keeping that spine nice and long and nice and strong. And then that kettlebell swing is a really good heart raiser, really, really good for progressively using that glutes to drive you forward and getting that good hip extension, which is going to be really, really translatable into some movements and other weightlifting pursuits. And then that Turkish get up is one of the biggest movements that always gets associated to the kettlebell. So I thought it would be rude not to include that one. But again, it's functional and it's really, really difficult. So it's great to include within your programming and other people's programming if you want a really good compound finisher or just want to really good and get really good proficient at that type of movement. So again, another wee challenge for you guys to think of. And I'm happy to hear some people someone saying that they find it easier on one side than the other. That's going to be the case. You might have tightness or you might have weakness on certain parts of the body. You might be right-handed versus left-handed. You might have a stronger side and a weaker side. But it's important for you to maybe highlight that and kind of note down where you're feeling the challenges, because that might mean that you can go away and maybe do some isolation exercises to sort of strengthen that area and improve that, or flexibility work to help you improve that as well. Okay, we've got 25 minutes left of this workshop. So what I'd quickly like to do is just refer you guys to the workbook that I'm going to share over, which should hopefully be on your screen at the moment. And in that workbook, I have covered the squat, the deadlift, the kettlebell swing, plus you'll see a little bit further down on page 17 and page 18, you've got my coaching points for the kettlebell swing, which will hopefully be quite useful for you guys going forward with your clients or for yourselves. On page 19, you've got your Turkish get up, and then you've got my reminder of my coaching points on page 20, just to help you guys going through that. But then down on page 21 and page 22, you've got a big, long, this isn't a comprehensive list by any means, but there is some exercises that can be done using a kettlebell just as easily as they can be done using a dumbbell or using a barbell, for example. So sometimes people think that kettlebells can only be used for swings and Turkish get-ups, when actually it can be used for lots and lots of different exercises. And this long list is going to be available for you. So I'm going to share that out at the end of this talk. Before I forget, I might just do it right now, because there's a high chance I'm guilty for forgetting these type of things. So what I'm going to do in the chat section, I am going to share over this document just so that everyone has got a copy of it. So bear with me just before I forget. And this will be shareable. If it's not downloadable for some strange reason, sometimes there's a bit of an issue with certain providers and if you're on a laptop versus a tablet, if you email the office, they have the link for it and they are more than happy to share that over with you if you cannot get it by me sharing with it just now. So 2 seconds, just about there, before I move on to some other movements really quickly. So it should now be arriving in the chat section. It'll take a little bit of a minute. You can then download it directly from the chat at the moment if you want to. But if you can't download it from the chat, best next thing to do, email the office at admin@drummondeducation.com and they will share that workbook over with you via a link or an attachment. But as you've seen on page 21 and page 22, there is a big, long, comprehensive list of movements that I'm just going to quickly do a really brief whistle-stop tour around some upper body movements and some lower body movements. I'm not going to have a great amount of time to go through them in much detail, but I'm just going to quickly show you different movement possibilities that are available using a kettlebell. So again, I'll just quickly tidy my little area up. So thinking about what you can do in the front room, if you've got kettlebells just now, or for your clients, if you want to use kettlebells a bit more effectively in the future. Upper body movements. So you can do shoulder work with your kettlebell. You can do standing single arm military press or shoulder press with the kettlebell, using your deltoids, triceps, and trapezius to elevate that above body. You can obviously do two hands at the same time. You can do a little bit more core engagement, or if you want to take by standing up, you're obviously engaging your core. You can bring yourself into a kneeling position, or if you want to make it even more challenging, you can do it from a seated position, really engaging that core to keep yourself in a nice long and strong position with your spine. Yes, you can do that with dumbbells as well, but just showing you and reminding you what's capable with a kettlebell. If you've got a bench at home, you can do chest press. If you don't have a bench at home, you can do what's called a kettlebell floor press. So kettlebell floor press, you bring your kettlebell to roughly in line with your shoulder. You can use one hand or both hands to bring yourself up into a nice, good, strong starting position. And then you can do a chest exercise. So pectoralis major, pec minor, serratus anterior, triceps and deltoids, working to bring yourself up into that floor press. I'll just turn myself around, bring this up into nice starting position. Humerus resting on the floor, bringing that up. The only thing with the floor press that's slightly different from the chest press is because my humerus gets limited and obviously touches the floor, I've not got the same range of motion as you would if you were on a bench, because with a bench press, you can take your humerus down below your shoulder joint, which means you've got a higher range of motion or an increased range of motion. Whereas your movement gets slightly limited doing a floor press, but still, if you want to work your chest muscles whilst at home, you can include that exercise in there. Sorry, I've just not really got my angles right for you guys. Other shoulder exercises, you can do frontal raises, you can do lateral raises for your deltoids. If you want to do some upper body exercises there, you can do row exercises. You can do predominantly the best rowing exercise to do with a kettlebell is going to be a single arm row, keeping that back nice and straight. That's going to be rhomboids, biceps, trapezius, lats, a little bit of deltoid activation as well. I would always recommend single arm over double arm. Because of double arm, you're not going to get the same range of motion because of where your hands are, and it gets limited by your body. So you're not going to get the same lat, rhomboid, and trapezius activation than you would if you're doing single arm. Because single arm, you're getting a good range of motion, whereas double-handed, you get stuck here. Whereas single-handed, you can move all the way through, and you can get really good scapular retraction by doing single arm better than double arm. So that would be my professional opinion. If you want to work the back, single arm kettlebell rows are probably going to be slightly better than double arm. But if someone's quite limited with what they've got, if they've only got a heavy kettlebell and they can't do single arm, then double arms is absolutely fine. Just have a quick look at some of the other exercises. You could do renegade rows, which is like a bit more of a core activation for your quads, for your back. So again, ideally you would have both the same height and the same weight. You can either include a press up, or you can just get yourself in a nice rowing position here. So that's a renegade row, or you get a renegade row with press. So that'd be working chest and shoulders back to back. What else have we got? Bicep curls, hammer curls, and tricep extensions and such. So bicep curl, nice and simple, overhand grip, or what's called a supine grip, which is when palms facing the sky, working the biceps that way. You can also do a bit of a supine grip, which is hand over. Not quite as easy to do because it will slide through, and the weight will always want to dangle down, so it might place a little bit more difficulty on your wrist. So that's the easiest one to probably do. You can also do a hammer grip. If I quickly use this, for example, not probably the best. I'd recommend maybe using a tea towel or something that's easier than this to use. But what you can do is you can do what's known as a hammer curl. So this is going to be a prone grip, or sorry, a neutral grip. And I can do with a tea towel or a strong bit of material. I can manipulate and play around with that a little bit. So instead of doing that grip, I've now accommodated that grip with that movement. You've then got tricep extensions, which you can do single-handedly for your triceps. Or if you've got a slightly heavier weight, you can do that with both hands, holding the kettlebell in a safe manner. So again, you can do that single hand or double hand. You can also do tricep kickbacks, straightening and just moving that, using your triceps to extend at the elbow. You probably need a lighter weight for that one. Another quite good one for adding a little bit more shoulder stability could be what's called bottom up shoulder press. So you can see how the bottom of the kettlebell is facing up, and I'm having to stabilize on the way up and on the way down because the kettlebell wants to come round. So I'm having to use my grip and stabilize that movement up and down. So that's quite a good progression that's available there. You can also do internal and external rotation of your shoulder with a kettlebell as well. So that's a wee whistle stop tour around some upper body exercises. We've already looked at some of the squat variations and some of the deadlift variations. You can also think about lunges. So you can do kind of suitcase hold lunges. So holding the weight down by your side, get yourself, some people are always, do you step forward, do you step back? Whatever your preference is, honestly. So if you're more comfortable stepping back, that's fine. If you're more comfortable stepping forward, that's fine. As long as you remember that whatever leg is at the front is going to be your working leg. So this leg is my right leg. That's going to be my working leg up and down, driving me up. So that's called a suitcase sort of hold. Obviously, just holding that down by your side. Whatever you do on one side, you do on the other. You can make it more challenging by including that front rack position that we introduced earlier on, up and down. And you can have a little play around that. Some people seem to be having a problem just on the iPad for some reason, which is strange. 2 seconds. Is it just for those that might be on the iPad seems to be having an issue? I can see other people waving, and some people, obviously, some people can see me, some people can't. Apologies for that. Seems to be a bit of an iPhone or maybe an iPhone bit of an issue. It might be worth just quickly logging off and logging back on. We've got 10 minutes to go. So if you want to log off and log back on, please feel free. Otherwise, it seems to be fine. It must be sort of iPad or iPhone an issue. Or just maybe try and refresh that. Lunges were the kind of where I was. Another sort of progression to make things more difficult could be an overhead lunge, which is going to be even more challenging. Sorry, I'll just have to kind of keep an eye on admitting people in as they come. So kind of keeping that overhead, adding that shoulder stability with the kettlebell. But because you can hold that weight at the back of the wrist, it helps keep quite a nice, secure shoulder joint. So hopefully that'll be quite nice and easy. But if you have missed anything that since you've been logging in and logging out, just remember that the link will be available for you next week to download. With lunges as well, you can maybe make it a little bit more core by lunging, passing the weight through, and then lunging back up, lunging, a little bit of a rotation, which can make your lunges a wee bit more challenging in that direction. Quickly, I'll just quickly keep adding people in. So there's different ways that you can manipulate your lunges to make things a bit more challenging. You can do what is known as a split squat. So a split squat is like a lunge, but you're elevating your rear foot or your front foot. So elevated split squat, placing my back leg. So now what I've done is I'm increasing the ability or range of motion that I can go down into on my front leg. You could do the same on both, split squat front or split squat back. You can also elevate front leg and lower down and lower up. It's going to be a lot more challenging by lowering your back leg, because that allows you to get greater focus and deeper range of motion on your front leg. And you can do that with a kettlebell, either front rack position, suitcase position, overhead position. If you're a bit of a rebel or a bit of a rogue, please feel free. So you can have a little play around with some of the exercises. You can do some calf raises, play around with sort of lots of exercises. And then lastly, we're going to be thinking about some kind of more kind of compound exercises, which are going to be larger global movements. So thinking about compound movements, you could do what's called a kettlebell thruster, which is basically a squat into a press, which is going to be, again, really demanding, upper body, lower body, shoulders and legs, as well as arms, and obviously engaging your core. You can do what's called a high pull. So a shoulder exercise is an upright row. If you combine that with a squat, that's known as a high pull. So that's going to be good compound movements that are good with a kettlebell. We've got our swings, we've got our get-ups. Similar to sort of Romanian deadlifts a little bit. You can bring the kettlebell like a halo up round to the upper back, and you can hold it in a nice position here, keep that back nice and strong, and you can do what are known as good mornings, keeping that back nice and straight, nice and long. And then on the way down, that's obviously your eccentric motion, but then concentrically, you're using your back muscles and your hip muscles to extend back up. So that's a good compound exercise: core, back, legs, glutes. Another couple that might be quite useful to go through just before we wrap up is you've got this one that's called the windmill. So like a Turkish get up, I'm going to keep that kettlebell elevated. I'm going to point my feet at a slightly 45-degree angle. I'm going to bend this leg, and I'm going to slide down that leg. So that's known as your windmill, sliding down, core rotation. That's quite difficult. Again, whatever you do on one side, you do on the other. Okay. You can do sort of figure of eights when you pass through. So adding a little bit of core rotation. You can do side dips. Whatever you do on one side, you do on the other. You can do Russian twists, twisting to the side. So as you can see, there's plenty kettlebell exercises that you guys can do that are your resistance, traditional resistance training exercises that you guys can have a little think of. And the last kind of couple that I'm just going to quickly show you that we're not going to have time to really coach is just what it would look like from an Olympic lift point of view. So you've got a clean and a hang clean, a snatch and a hang snatch, and then a clean and jerk. The difference between a hang and a full version is the hang stays at the hips and doesn't go all the way to the floor. So for a hang clean, for example, you're going to do that single arm dumbbell squat position with that thumb to bum. You're going to explosively drive, but then you're going to catch the kettlebell in your front rack position. So let's swing through, drive, and catch. Through, drive, and catch. Through, and catch. That's your hang clean. The full clean goes all the way to the floor. So you go to the floor, explosively stand up, and catch. Explosively stand up. You come underneath and you catch the kettlebell safely on your shoulder. You don't let it whack. And it's all about supporting that rotation of the wrist to try and comfortably get the kettlebell towards the back of the hand. So that's your clean from the floor, which is that one. And then your hang clean, which is that one. You've then got a hang snatch, which is when you take it straight up overhead, through, explosively driving up, and then full would be to the floor. So hang from the waist, and then full to the floor, which is snatch or hang snatch. And then the last one would be clean and jerk. So here, and then drive up, and then catch underneath. So here, catching your clean, and drive into your jerk. So they can be very good translatable exercises to start flowing yourself in to some Olympic lifts. Whew, puffed it. That was a real whistle-stop tour around some, not all, but some additional resistance training exercises that you could think about including in your training, as well as your clients' training, with the handiest piece of kit, in my opinion, or one of the handiest pieces of kit, which is a kettlebell. So hopefully you found that useful. Just a quick reminder that everything that I've said today does get recorded. That'll be available for you guys next week. I've sent the session notes over. If you've not got access to them, give the office a wee call, a wee email, admin@drummondeducation.com. They'll send the notes over to you. So hopefully my main key takeaways from that is you're feeling a bit more confident with the kettlebell swing, the Turkish get up, just really getting good coaching points when it comes into your squats and your deadlifts, and then just a quick refresher on everything that you can do with that kettlebell. So hopefully you found that useful. Thanks very much for sticking with me for that 2 hours. Like I say, hopefully you found it useful. Everything will be available for you guys afterwards. Wish you the best of luck going forward in this crazy lockdown period, but hopefully it won't be too long until we're back to normal. So thanks again. I'll hang around a little bit afterwards, but I do appreciate you guys are probably busy. So that's me. All the best. And if anyone's got any burning questions that they would like to ask, I'll hang around. But otherwise, head off and enjoy the rest of your Thursday.